Right, thank you very much. So we'll now enter into the open debate. We invite the audience to put up their hands for questions.
You refer to the free trade agreements. We were members of EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, prior to the EU, which functioned in just the same way and effectively, and allowed us as well free trade with Commonwealth countries who had been very loyal to us. You also referred to celebrating today being the end of the First World War. That lasted a long time, didn't it? It wasn't long before Germany rearmed again and had problems that originated from Berlin, and we are now being systematically raped and pillaged by the Berlin banks. How would you like to respond to that, gentleman?
Shall I start? Do you mind if we sit down?
No,
Can I start with the last bit? There was a famous cartoon published, I think, in 1919, which showed Clemenceau, the French president, French prime minister, and President Wilson of the United States walking down a corridor in their frock coats, and in the corner was a baby crying. And on its tummy, it said, the class of 1940. So even at the time of the Versailles Treaty, it was expected that this may lead to war again, and it did. But one of the things that differentiated the First War from the Second War, and I mentioned one of the two causes for the First World War, one, military rearmament in Germany, and two, the behaviour of the occupying troops against many populations, which was appalling. The Second World War had an unalloyed, absolutely clear motivation. It was to defeat fascism, which by the 1939 start of the war had become completely clear to all as a major and malign influence in Europe and the world. So there was no question about not going to war. In the end, we had to do it. And it was, if I may say so, Jean-Claude Juncker, who is the current Commission President, astonished me one day. He was in the European Parliament representing his country, Luxembourg, and the MEPs were bleating about Britain, as they very often do, the BSE crisis or something. And he rounded on the European Parliament and said, ladies and gentlemen, you attacked Britain, but if Britain had not stood by us in 1940, we wouldn't be free today. And that surprised me, but a lot of people feel that. So, I mean, I don't think we need to ignore the lessons of history. As to the German banks, they're not that powerful. The banks in London are infinitely more influential in the world than the German banks are.
If I come back to the beginning end of what you were saying, I don't believe that the EU is the sole repository of peace in Europe. I think that NATO is involved. I think that the US overspending on our defence for decades has been gratefully received in this country, not so gratefully received in some countries on the continent. However, it is obviously not, the EU is not a reason for conflict. Or at least until recently, it hasn't been the cause of conflict. It has, in fact, been, and I think Edward was picking up the business about in 1989, as it was definitely an aspiration for the countries of the Eastern Bloc to join the EU as a sort of as a recognition that they were grown-up nations again, and proper nations and free nations. However, I think that what's happened since the financial crisis, exacerbated, though not necessarily caused by the euro, and the restrictions placed on countries and how they can act, and also the lies told by countries in order to get into the euro, in the case of Italy. And what we saw was Europe actually creating trouble. And you just have to remember the riots in Greece, and the suffering in Cyprus, and the 50% youth unemployment in Spain, and the demonstrations in Spain against the austerity, the fact that Podemos, a Eurosceptic socialist party, is now leading the polls in Spain, and that is a strictly anti-European party because it feels that Europe's austerity policies has damaged people and created abject misery in Euromed. Europe is no longer a force for peace in Europe as it was in 1989, in the period that Edward was talking. It is actually causing conflict. As to the trade business, well, there is a world out there. Outside the European Union is sadly sadly for us because we're in it, and sadly for them because they're in it too, is reducing in its capacity to trade. It is becoming an ever decreasing circle in its own interest, whereas the rest of the world is actually growing. And I personally believe that Britain would be best trading with the rest of the world more freely and not relying solely on the EU to set its trade relations. But of course we wouldn't stop trading with Europe because they trade with us. And they flog us stuff and we flog them stuff, and that works.
This brings me on to a question I wanted to bring in off Twitter. So what do both candidates, both speakers here tonight, think would happen with Britain's relationship with the EU if we were to leave? How would we respond with Europe? Would we still trade? What do candidates think?
Well,
how would our relationship be?
Well, I think I was alive when we weren't in the EU, so perhaps I should not be the first to answer. Clearly, some people are already discounting British withdrawal from the European Union. And I was interested that Gowain referred to the opinion poll, which showed that despite the rise in UKIP, as it were, the popularity of the European Union, or membership of the European Union, actually rose as well. So there's a paradox there. I personally think that if the British people were to vote, they would vote as they did in 1975, again, 2/3 in favour of staying in, with whatever changes may have been arrived at. Today's decision by the European Court of Justice on the rights of immigrants to non-contributory benefits is extremely important, because that worries people a lot. We haven't talked about immigration, but I'm sure we'll get onto that. But it's a major factor in people's attitudes towards the European Union, because the Podemos groups and others like them believe that the European Union is to blame. So to the extent that Britain is concerned about its membership of the European Union, a loss of sovereignty, the perceived problems of immigration, and so on and so on. But when it comes down to it, if the facts are actually presented to people, as indeed on immigration, once again the University College London report last week reaffirmed what it said a few months ago, immigration is a net benefit to the UK. So that's why it's important this evening we talk about this coherently and quietly and thoughtfully, because in the general election to come, you will have a choice, and those people who voted Conservative will want to have that referendum. It is not to say that Labour or Liberal Democrat, being in government, wouldn't offer the same proposition, because there is a sense among many people that it is time for that referendum, and the time is the day of the general election. That's something we could talk about. I've got no fears on that count, and it's something which will emerge over the coming weeks.
Do you think we'll vote to stay in?
I think it will be. If the vote was to take place today, I suspect it would be very close. I think it would be very too close to call at this point. I don't think the 60-40 thing is feasible at this point. But I think that it will be interesting that as people draft their manifestos, as to whether Labour and the Lib Dems will offer a referendum. I suspect the Lib Dems will. I don't think Labour have got a clue what they're going to do at this point. I know they keep on saying they won't, but if, for example, my lot pick up another seat in Rochester, having swept up the Labour vote, if we keep on doing things as we did in South Yorkshire, raising from 11 to 33% in what was the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire, obviously things are changing, and the Labour Party are in trouble. But go back to the original question, your question, which is what would happen? Obviously, we don't know, because we haven't been here before. But I do not think that the wise and cool heads that everyone talks about amongst our friends on the continent would wish to stymie their trade and cultural links with this country any more than we would like to stymie them with them. The fact is that in the 40-odd years since we've been a member of the European Union, the balance of trade, except for 1 year in the late 70s, has always been in our friends' favour rather than our own. And it's a bit trite, but the fact is that Citroën, Renault, Mercedes are still going to want to flog their cars here, and we're still going to want to buy them. We're going to want to sell our services to them, and they're going to want to buy them too. Trade between friends is going to continue. Now, There are some on the continent who would like to throw their toys out of the pram. I can think of one person particularly, who's now a European Commissioner from Belgium, Marianne Thyssen, who gets terribly, terribly worked up about the UK. But by and large, the wiser heads would say that would be stupid. You also have, of course, the WTO rules superseding and over the top of this. But as I said, I basically believe that business would not accept its politicians to stop their ability to do business. And I don't think there is any, there's any appetite either in this country or on the continent for unpleasantness between the two places. So I don't think yes, we don't know. There'd be enormous amounts of work in Whitehall to unpick where we are, and I think that would be much harder than many people on my side admit to. We have 180,000 pages of law we've got to look through, and that would take a long time. There is a great deal of institutional capacity this country does not have because we've handed over our ability to do stuff, negotiate, trade negotiations, things of this sort. We would have to rebuild our capacity to act as an independent nation. This is all true, and this would all be problems, and there will be problems that come up in any referendum campaign. But just because there's problems doesn't mean it isn't right to do. If we all stopped doing anything because it was difficult, we'd still be living in caves.
Can I just, if I may, two small points. One is that international trade is not a zero-sum game. You don't say, we export less than them and therefore we're doing badly. The whole point about trade is the free flow. And the mechanisms that provide for that free flow are, among other things, the Treaty of Rome and the four freedoms within the European Union. We are currently, as the European Union, negotiating a free trade agreement with America.
Yes.
If it came off, it would be an enormous boost to the prosperity of both the European Union and the United States itself.
And as we know, that trade deal includes TTIP, which is going to cause enormous troubles for the independence of the NHS. So there are huge issues with these trade deals.
I don't buy these scares. I'm surprised you're using them, Graham, because that's what the Greens are doing during the European elections.
It's corporatist. It's not free trading, it's corporate.
It's part of the negotiation. Let's just, just one bit of nitty-gritty. There's no Tory here on the platform to speak for them, so that bit of me that's a Tory will now explain that what the government have done in order to keep the ball rolling is to examine every single element of our relationship with the European Union. Every government department has gone through a thing called the balance of competences looking at environment or agriculture or trade, fisheries, looking at whether it's better or not for the UK to be in and what improvements they might make. And everything so far that's been done by these grey civil servants in London, poring over the figures, looking at the issues, looking at the stack of legislation that Gowain's referred to, is there's practically nothing that they want to change. And it's not because they're civil servants and just love the bureaucracy, it's because the United Kingdom does well as all other member states do out of the European Union. Not one of those has yet come up with a coherent reason why we should leave.
Okay, to respond, do you think we do better in all aspects, or do you agree with this point?
I doubt I'd be sitting here if I did. I do disagree. And he's right, of course, the trade isn't a zero-sum game. Trade benefits both ends, the seller and the purchaser. Of course it does. But it is also true that there are two countries in the continent of Europe that have a free trade deal with China. They are Switzerland and Iceland. Europe doesn't. There's one country that has a free trade deal with India. That's Switzerland. We don't even have a free trade deal with Australia. Think about this for a second. Same language, same culture, they play cricket. They've got the Queen. And we can't have a free trade deal with them because our dear friends on the continent don't like the fact that the Australians produce a couple of products that would undercut the French, for example, wine. And the same with New Zealand. French farmers burning sheep, remember anything? The fact is, it is madness that this country cannot have free trade deals with people, and it's the legal system as well. It would actually be terribly easy for this country to set up free trade deals with countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, because we share so much in common, both at a legal level, so that the little bureaucrats and gnomes who wander around and do the details and speak a similar legal language. But
Sometimes people might become civil servants.
Don't do it. But the point is with the freedom to act in this country's interest, these trade deals would be far easier to come by. I happen to believe. Now, it won't be perfect, it won't be easy, we'll make the most colossal errors, but they'll be our errors. And it'll be our responsibility to deal with them, rather than somebody else's errors and we can do nothing about them.
Can I make one last point on trade?
One last point we should
One last point.
trade.
Let's get this absolutely clear. We sell more to Belgium than we do to India.
Isn't that tragic?
It's an extraordinary fact.
Right, moving off of trade, another question from the audience. Gentleman in the grey.
I'm just wondering what the panel think of the European arrest warrant, given, well, it was sort of not passed, kind of, I don't know what happened yesterday, Commons don't really know. So yeah, just what the panel think about it.
There's no Tory here to answer this.
Shall I go first on that one? Yeah, and the European arrest warrant, I have huge issues with. Actually, I wish it wasn't called the European arrest warrant, because I think the European aspect of it queers the debate. It really makes it a problem, because it brings in the Eurosceptics going, it's evil, and it brings the pro-Europeans saying, it's something wonderful. I actually think that we should have opposed the European arrest warrant on basic civil liberties grounds. And it's exactly the same with our extradition treaty with the States, which I also oppose, and UKIP also oppose. It is wrong, in principle, that somebody in this country, under the protection of this country's laws, habeas corpus and everything else, should be sent to a foreign jurisdiction with no prima facie evidence presented in a British court. Period. Full stop. End. No ifs, no buts. We should not be sending people, for whatever reason, without evidence presented. I was quizzed about this by a Spanish journalist yesterday, and she turned to me and said, but what happens if there was some bloke from ETA in Britain? It would take 10 years for you to send him over to us. If you don't have the evidence, can you prove he's from ETA? If you had a Parti Populaire party, say, run by a woman, Carmen Fraga-esque, a sort of an extreme Parti Popular party in Spain, and they wished to have some Henri Batistuta, Basque nationalist journalist, picked up and sent to Spain because they found him uncomfortable, all they would have to say, we believe X, and the British court would have to send him over because the European arrest warrant says so. This is wrong. And if an Irish nationalist from Ulster, or wherever, who was a Sinn Féin supporter, who was not involved in criminal activities, but was a real pain in the arse to the UK establishment and authorities, was in Spain, we could apply to the Spanish and demand he get sent over here for a similar reason. That would also be wrong. Nobody should be arrested without evidence. Nobody should be extradited without evidence. It is just wrong.
Okay, this is the Lib Dem in me now. I was settling down yesterday afternoon with the telly on. I'm idly watching what I thought was going to be a debate on the European arrest warrant, while I toyed with what I was going to say to you this evening. And something was going on. Very rarely in the House of Commons is there something quite so palpably obvious as a crisis. There was Theresa May wearing a green suit, looking absolutely terrified. There was Michael Gove, the chief whip, sidling in alongside her, passing notes between them. There was a look of utter panic on the face of the government. There were no Lib Dems there, incidentally. And on the front bench. And what had happened was the following. It was that everybody had been told that yesterday evening, there'd be a long debate on the European arrest warrant, the substance of it, and at the end of it there would be a vote. And there are a lot of Tories who don't like the European arrest warrant for various reasons, including some that Gowain has adduced. But the majority of members of the House of Commons would have backed it, as have a whole range of senior judges, all the police organisations. Theresa May herself, the Home Office, very much wants to maintain the European arrest warrant because it does some very useful things. There are some safeguards. They have been built in. It does protect habeas corpus. And here's a nugget for you. The United Kingdom has refused, since July, 21 applications for the removal of people from our shores and vice versa, because they were deemed to be unfair. We can do it, and we will continue to do it, as other countries do. So there are safeguards built in. I don't think it's an unalloyed benefit to this country, but I think it is a benefit, because the zero-sum game in this is that there are very many criminals who cross frontiers and have evaded justice. One thing the European arrest warrant does is to speed up that justice. That's the very bottom of it.
I just want to come back. It is one of these glorious European things that Europe creates a problem and then the solution is more Europe. One of the great problems is the free movement of people. People can cross borders. Criminals cross borders. Let's have more Europe to deal with that problem. The most recent high-profile case, of course, was that ghastly family who removed their child from a hospital and took them to Spain and then to, Czech Republic to have their child treated not in the NHS. And the police invoked a arrest warrant and had them brought back to this country because they had the temerity to care about their child. That, and what happened after that, was a disgrace. Now, of course, there are terrorists and other people, but currently it's 9 to, no, by the way, it's 9 to 1. 9 people from this country are extradited to the continent, as opposed to 1 to the continent this way. There have been some changes. I don't know if the Simeon case would happen today, under the slight amendments that have taken place, but Andrew Simeon, having been dragged over to Greece, was kept in jail for 15 months, and then the case was dropped for no evidence. 15 months in a Greek prison because of the European arrest warrant.
Well, let me pose a question. Okay, so let me accept that the jurisdictions around the European Union are not as perfect as our own. And I wouldn't argue. How many Greeks are in this room? Okay, what I'm going to say now may slightly offend you, but over my 30 years as a member of the European Parliament, I have dealt with some cases involving British citizens in Greece that have been troubling. And so I would accept there are some problems. There's a deficiency in certain member states which is being corrected because of the European arrest warrant, because the jurisdictions within the European Union work so closely together to try and make punishment equal, crimes equal, and that's really important within a single market. So I completely agree with you. These things grow up because there's a single market, because there's freedom of movement, but they are actually a benefit to all of us, provided that everybody operates on, broadly speaking, the same basis. And there are some countries that need to improve, and they know they have to.
Can these countries improve?
I'm sure they can, but I suspect the improvements in those countries are best driven from within those countries than from without. I just happen to think that, and I don't think that in some cases you've got an equalising effect, and I think that our justice system has got worse in order that, to a certain extent, not everything is the highest common denominator. What you see is a sort of low middle common denominator with Europe. It's not the lowest, it's not the worst. Everything doesn't go to the bottom, certainly not, and certainly there have been improvements. I mean, there's no doubt that in countries such as Bulgaria and Romania, where there are still huge questions about the legal system, about corruption and otherwise, and the European Union admits it itself that these problems exist, that things will probably get a bit better because of EU membership, and there's certainly no doubt that for those countries that wish to join Europe, that they do, and this is something that I know that Edward has worked on, they do have to pick up gear a bit when it comes to reform of their courts and justice system. There's absolutely no doubt of that. But I'm a bit selfish. I care about this country, and I worry about the rights and civil liberties of people in this country more than I do about those in other countries. I cannot pretend to love every man, or woman for that matter. And my interest, and I think the interest of those people elected in this country, are about looking after here first. Now, it's good to help elsewhere, and it's nice to be nice. But I actually do think that this is the place that I care about most. And I have no embarrassment about that.
Let's move off the European arrest warrant. Another question from the audience. Gentleman there.
Despite the deepest recession for 70 years, despite a huge swell in nationalism, and despite a huge despondency with Westminster, on the 18th of September, a Scotsman who'd spent 30 years of his life in politics failed to convince enough of his country people to break away from the United Kingdom. So why does a guy who in his 20s was a city banker and he's actually posher than a Tory think that he can convince enough people in the UK to actually break away from the European Union?
No. I think, yeah, Farrell.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think he's posher than Edward. Edward's after all is related to people with VCs at the Battle of Alma and T. Lawrence and all the rest.
I'm pretty humble.
Farage is the son of a stockbroker, was a metals trader in the city. It's very odd. I agree. It is extremely odd. How is it that somebody like that is able to, in some way, communicate to people who ordinarily wouldn't give him the time of day? Very good question. Not sure how he does it, but he does. Last year we did this ridiculous tour where we wear mustard trousers round the UK. And I was in Cornwall, and I was in Oswald Twistle in the Working Man's Club. In fact, I was at Working Man's Club only a couple of weeks ago in Doncaster with him. And Harrogate, with ladies with nice little cups, and so on and so forth. And what I...
Harrogate again.
Yeah. But what I find very interesting, because it will not come as a surprise to you that I've heard this speech before. It alters a little bit compared to which place he's at, and the jokes sometimes change, but I'm not listening and dropping on Mr. Farage's every word at every speech, I will admit. So I'm sitting at the back talking to people while the speech goes forward, and I've heard the same phrase in Cornwall, in Lancashire, in Harrogate, in Whitby actually, in Castle-the-Street, wildly different people. He speaks my language. And they don't give a hoot that he wears a covered coat. They don't give a damn that he smokes. They don't care. Because he seems to be speaking about things that have been verboten for such a long time. And that is why, I was talking about the 11% to 33% in South Yorkshire. That's why. It's weird. I don't know. I really don't know how he does it, or why he does it, or how it works. But it seems to work. I remember editor of the Today programme telling me, he said, weird thing about your boss, Gowain, he speaks fluent human.
Was that Little?
It was after Little. But that, I don't know. I can't answer. It's weird, but he does. He does speak to people of all varieties. Many of whom think he's vile, of course.
Do you think the Little Democrats are failing to connect with the people over Europe?
I think politicians generally are failing to connect, and I think it underestimates Nigel's achievement over the years in building a party from very little. He stood himself as a candidate in Winchester and Westminster, got a derisory vote back in Cornwall's way.
He beat the loonies by some 12.
But I mean, if you really want to know, read The Revolt on the Right, which is the history of UKIP, a very detailed history, which shows how it used basically Lib Dem tactics to build from council seats outwards, organisation, money, people, commitment, and so on. It's the traditional way that Lib Dems do things below the surface, the so-called ground war, which I saw for myself in May. It worked incredibly well in Yorkshire and Humber for all the council seats, which we held. We even won a by-election here the other day for the council. So, you know, if you operate on that basis, and that's what UKIP does, it's highly effective. How they use that new power is not clear. The one thing I will say about Nigel Farage, he has a transcending personality. Whatever it is, he talks human, I don't know. But it is perfectly true that he has cut through in a way that other politicians do not. And I don't, it's not because of any sort of extremism, it's a way of projecting. Now, I happen to know quite a lot of people who are pretty pissed off with Nigel Farage behind the scenes, and they do spill the beans from time to time, but the one extraordinary thing about it, so far, is that nobody seems to care terribly. You know, I've tried myself to pinpoint certain deficiencies in the way UKIP spends its money from Europe and so on and so on. Nobody's interested. So that's the magic. But one day, the public will think very carefully about what it is that UKIP actually represents, because it cannot hold power, either in the European Parliament or in Westminster. It's highly unlikely they get more than 3 or 4 members of Parliament in the general election, whereas the Lib Dems will have 30, 40, 50, who knows?
And a quarter of our vote.
That's the difference. Anyway.
Another question from the audience, please. Lady at the front.
It's important that we now get round to the subject of immigration. I'll leave it at that.
Right.
Do you want
Okay.
to respond to Edward's earlier comment about the UCL study?
Yeah, go on.
All right. Well, I think it was interesting that everyone pointed out that the UCL study was a restatement of previous statements made by the same chaps. I don't go with that. They were slated in the press because I think they were slated in the press because they had funny names. I think that's what it seemed to come across as. That doesn't sound making sense to me. Just okay, so he made an absolute stuff up of the famous 13,000 on the first enlargement, the A8 enlargement. He made a complete stuff up of that, but people make mistakes, and I don't think that the arguments against that report that seem to focus on that he made a big mistake then and therefore he can't be right now. That doesn't work. However, I do think there's a great deal of that study is problematic. I think there's a great deal of stuff that's not mentioned. And also, I think this is actually quite important on the broader scheme of things. To the study, the UCL study, the only thing that matters is economic growth. We don't think that. We think there's more to life than beans. We think there's more to society than pure growth, the dash for growth, GDP. Now, if by reducing the scope and the scale, the sheer scale of migration to this country, it means that over a period of time we see a diminution of the level of growth, the percentage GDP growth over a period of time, so be it. If it means that society is more comfortable, society is happier, and we can cope with the changes that migration bring. We think that GDP per capita is a far more important thing than GDP as a national thing. And that study, the benefits brought by migration of the last 3 years, and interesting that they just focused on those last 3 years rather than the broader scale of things, the benefits brought, I think, are overstated. I think they're purely financial. And if you brought in, if everybody in this room was to give the other person, the person sitting next to them, £1, you would have a level of GDP. If we then brought in another 50 people, and so you're all squeezed really tight on your chairs, and they each gave each person £1, there would be more economic activity, but it'd be really uncomfortable in the room. And that, in a very simple way, I've got no problem with migration, absolutely none, as theoretically, and UKIP doesn't either. We also feel, of course, that because the country at large is getting increasingly, there is increasing disquiet, particularly in some parts of the country, at the level of migration and the impact, of course, on services, schools, hospitals, NHS, bank, all that stuff. And these are very real concerns and they shouldn't be dismissed. Because of that, and there is a recognition from all parties now, and I think UKIP, whether you like us or not, should be applauded for allowing people to talk about migration without the scream of racist being thrown at anybody who dares mention the word. And we've changed that, and now all parties are talking about migration in a much more serious fashion, and I think that's a good thing. But the way that the parties have responded, of course, is because we're members of the European Union, and because of the principle of free movement of people, and all those promises of Mr. Cameron saying, oh, change it. And Mrs. Merkel says, oh, no, you won't. Bang, collapse the Stout Party.
All day.
Well, but that's a benefits issue, and the benefits issue is peanuts. It really is. It is peanuts. The quantity of people from the EU taking benefits is absolutely. It's a shibboleth. It's a straw man argument. That's not the problem. But the basic problem the problem we've got is the only way that our governors can have an impact on migration to this country is to cut down on non-EU migration. Cut the numbers of people coming from the Commonwealth. Cut the numbers of people coming from elsewhere. And weirdly, what this results in is instead of having a colourblind migration policy, the other three parties are now instituting and coming up with plans to have a non-colourblind migration policy. And that we oppose. We think, as a party, you can believe that all people should be treated equally from wherever they come, from whatever colour, creed, nationality. And because they can't do anything about the EU migration, the other parties are clamping down on Africa, Asia, and elsewhere being able to come here. A little personal anecdote. My partner is an Australian-Indian doctor. She was working in the NHS. She had to do, because she was a non-EU citizen, she had to do a 2-hour English language test. She has 5 degrees from Australian University. The woman who took that, invigilated her exam, was Polish and could hardly speak English. And frankly, to be fair to her, was terribly embarrassed about the situation. But this is nuts. It is a ridiculous situation where we find ourselves at this point. And I think that the other parties are, because of the free movement of people, the absolute free movement of people, that forces them to do things which I don't think they like doing.
Well, look, your last point, Gowain, about your wife taking an English language exam, I think it shows that at least we're doing the right thing. I don't want to be treated by a doctor who can't speak English.
But European law stops you doing that.
It's
on the continent.
It's been changed.
No, it hasn't.
It has. And now, anybody working as a doctor in the UK has to have a language test, which is what your wife had to do. I'm sorry that it was invigilated by someone who wasn't as fluent as she was, as it were. So I think the wider question about immigration is, let's start with this point. We don't really know how many people are here from where. To give an example, it was recently discovered that a bent official, sorry about this, it's Poland again actually, in the British embassy, in the British consulate in Warsaw, I don't know whether it was a Brit or a Pole, was being bribed to give visas into the UK to Ukrainians. Now Ukraine is not in the European Union yet, I hope it will be soon. So Ukrainians have no right of entry. But they get a visa and they're allowed to come in. And I think it was something like 74,000 visas were issued to Ukrainians. And that's not just the only number of Ukrainians who are in this country, in effect, illegally. Because we don't really have proper controls. We should have better controls. It would probably be immensely expensive to do it. And so we have to tolerate a degree of laxity about the actual numbers. But what is important is within the European Union itself, that freedom of movement has to be preserved. It is actually a fundamental right. The number of people from the United Kingdom who are elsewhere, there are 1 million Brits living in Spain, 330,000 living in France, and 65,000 in Cyprus. I haven't got the figure for Greece itself, I'm sorry. There are also 330,000 in the Republic of Ireland. So it's not just them coming here, it's also us going there, us getting benefits. I mean, I have to tell you, I did a lot of work on timeshare and Costa Villa fraud when I was a young MEP. At that time, the Spanish had realised that this enormous influx of Northern Europeans, Danes and Germans and Brits, required them to improve their health service on the coasts. And they did. And you now get better health care as an elderly person living on the Costa Brava than you get living in Islington. Sad to say, 6 monthly checks, everything goes on. It's because Spain accepts its responsibility. So the whole issue of immigration has to be seen in a proper context. And in the context of the European Union, we should allow freedom of movement to them and for us. Once you start breaking apart the principles, then other countries will have their own prerogatives and priorities, and it will become incredibly difficult to work out. So stick with the free movement, deal with people having access to benefits. Gowain is right. Relatively few people from the European Union are taking benefits. But come back to the UCL studies. Last year and this year, sticking to the point, a benefit of £20 billion a year from immigration from the European Union. That's what the contribution is, and we shouldn't forget it.
Come back a little bit. A couple of points. One is the yes, of course, there are Brits living abroad. My father lives in northern France, and etc. 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 We know about this. We know there's many people from the UK living, it's particularly Spain and France, but elsewhere as well. The difference is the sort of people. Most of the Brits living abroad are retirees who are taking their money with them. Most of the people from the continent coming here are young and looking for work. Well, there's no harm in that. I know we can complain about looking for work. But one of the things the study, one of the problems with the study, is they're looking at, and as I said, it's only the last 3-4 years that we're talking about this, the 20 billion a year benefit that the country gets, is that we're talking about young people. Now, young people are less likely to use the health system. Young people are less, at this point, though that will change as things move forward, to use the education system. Their children are not yet old enough to go through it, and those pressures are there. So therefore, what we're seeing is an economic benefit from the fact they're working and shopping and all the rest of it, but we don't yet see the inbuilt economic cost as they get older. And those costs will come, trust me, they will. So it's a slightly dishonest study, this UCL study. And as I say, most of the Brits abroad are taking their money with them. They're at the end of their economic life in that sense, and so therefore they are investing in local properties, they are taking an awful lot of money with them out of this country to the continent. Now, good luck to them. I don't see any problem with that, and fine. But it's not like we'd like, it really isn't.
Why don't you commission using the enormous amount of money you're now getting from the European Union through all your MEPs? there was one here in Yorkshire before, Godfrey Bongo Bongo Blue, and that was okay. He was tolerable, and there are now 3. That's what did for me. So there are 3 from this region alone who are getting enormous expense allowances, which could be used for a study by the University of York into immigration into this country. Now, why don't you use your money usefully in that respect and stop criticising UCL? Why allude to the name of someone who's done a report? I mean, it seems to be rather trivial.
Well, I agree on that, and that's what I was trying to say. I think the attacks on them was more about their names and the fact that they made this stuff up 7, 8, 9 years ago, than it was about the reality of their report as it is this time. That if you read the reportage on it, it was largely around the fact of Tomaso or something. And that was silly.
Let's bring the debate back around to the EU, so I'd like to invite you to do your closing statements. If Gowain, if you'd like to go first. Final appeal to the audience to side with your motion.
Right, thank you very much, and thank you, Edward, for the debate, and thank you for the questions. I think, and I always have believed, that the reason why this country should leave the European Union is terribly, terribly simple. It is a matter of democracy. And we can argue about migration, we can argue about the European arrest warrant, we can argue about trade, we can argue about a whole series of different things, the common fisheries policy, this, that, the other, common space policy, why not? The whole shebang. But actually, most of that is detail, important detail, but detail. To me, it is about democracy. And to me, democracy, as we have it, and as we see it, and as it has grown in this country, is about the ability of the people to sack the boss. We hand over power every 5 years, now it's a fixed term, we hand over power every 5 years for people to make decisions on our behalf, but every 5 years we take that power back just for a day, just for 5 minutes, as we tick a little box and say, nah, you're rubbish. Or, well done, you can have another go. The problem with our membership of the European Union is that we can't sack the boss. Every single person in this country could vote for my law, or could vote for the Greens, or Labour, or the Lib Dems, or whoever, and it wouldn't really matter a jot if the majority of our friends on the continent voted for a different law. And this in itself, I think, is the fundamental problem that we have. To have a democracy, you need to have a demos, a people. And I do not think, for all sorts of historic reasons and cultural reasons, that the people of this country as a whole feel sufficiently alike. It is interesting that even Nick Clegg talks about Britain and Europe, not Britain as Europe, when he makes public statements. There is that difference, and you can point to the common law, and you can point to all sorts of things that are different about us. But the bottom line is, we should leave the European Union, because it gives us the right to decide who we are and who governs us. Nothing else.
Well, thank you, Gowain, thank you, Lisa, thank you all for coming. My closing remarks are based on the proposition that the European Union is close enough to touch. Brussels is not that far away. Whereas, for example, the United Nations, based in New York, has a tremendous amount of influence on a lot of things we do, and including world trade and all that sort of thing. And I'm put in mind of the famous travel writer who once said that Sao Paulo was rather like Reading, only further away. Well, the European Union is a bit like the United Nations, but it's a downside closer. And it's an international body of 28 countries who readily accepted to pool their sovereignty for the purposes of prosperity, of security, and of values. And first, starting with some of the criticisms, I've been an MEP, or was an MEP, for 30 years. During that time, I had repeatedly been told that we'd lose the pint, we'd have to use kilometres, you know, that we'd have to abolish British summertime because the EU wanted harmonisation. Well, actually, this country is very much like what it was 30 years ago, except a bit more prosperous. And I don't think the EU has made a massive change, apart from the criticism I've made myself for the common fisheries policy, which is a bit of a disaster. Agricultural policy, I come from landowning families on both sides, absolutely indefensible. But we can change it, and we should. What I'm more concerned about is prosperity in the future, and the European Union assures our prosperity in a way that nothing else can do. That single market, that achievement, that Treaty of Rome, and the bits that have been added onto it, allowing us to trade freely with 500 million people across this continent, is absolutely fundamental. And we are not in a world where peace is assured. And security is important too. Even though the European Union is not a military organisation, it is the counterpart to NATO. And that's why, whatever Russia may do, whatever Russia may threaten, the European Union is stronger than the sum of its parts, as it is when faced with challenges from China. So for security, for prosperity, and for values, may I just make one small point on children? My wife's a lawyer specialising in children. The Charter of Fundamental Rights, for the first time, brings child rights within the prospect of decisions of the European Court. And the principles are interesting. The paramountcy of the interests of a child in the legal system, that's widely accepted, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1977. But a new one was introduced in the Treaty of Lisbon, that a child has the right to both parents. A fundamental issue, but nobody had thought of it before. So it's not just about the prosperity, the market and everything else. It's about values too. And I'm proud of it. Thanks.
Right, we're going to take another vote count. So raise your hand if you agree with the proposition that this House is better off out of the European Union. You too.
How many people abstaining?
So, Edward, you've won the debate.
Oh, have I?
Is that-
Yes, and ask
Yeah.
who's opposed to the motion.
Yeah, you've swung. No, but we can work out the difference.
Oh, I
in
see.
voting.
Sorry.
And that's why I think we should leave Europe.
Just first one, a very great.
It's all right, we don't have to count the votes.
I'd love to know what the figures are. When I was a vice president, I used to preside over voting in the European Parliament. It's either electronic, pressing buttons, you know, green one for yes and red one for no and so on, or by show of hands. And as the European Parliament got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I have to say it's far too large with 750 members, actually to be accurate with a show of hands was pretty near impossible. And the usual cry from the people at the front of the thing was, take more water with it, when I made mistakes. But it was a fascinating process, and this evening's been a fascinating process too. So have you worked it out yet?
Yeah. Almost.
Theresa May had to filibuster for an hour last night to allow Tory MPs to get back to the House of Commons to vote.
You swayed 15 from, you took 15 votes from.
Oh, okay, plus 15. Jolly good. Thank you. Thank you.